Hello and welcome to another episode of Science Fiction Power Scaling. This episode isn't going to be about anything in particular except for the concept of numbers in power scaling. And by that, of course, I mean, for example, the size of fleets in comparison, especially when looking at different universes, different science fiction franchises. We can see that different franchises have different concepts of scale. For example, the Galactic Empire in Star Wars has a much bigger fleet than most of the main powers in any of the eras of Star Trek, with the possible exception of the Borg. Uh, and of course, um, the same goes in reverse, where you've got the Q continuum. We don't actually know how many Q there are, but if we only go on the ones that are confirmed to exist, the ones that we have seen on screen, each one of them is omnipotent to some degree, and and so small numbers can overcome larger numbers uh, in certain contexts. But it's always important to remember when doing a comparison of a an entire empire or interstellar state of some sort against another one from a different science fiction universe, as opposed to doing a comparison of a spaceship of one kind to a spaceship of another kind. And sometimes certain advantages and disadvantages, um, e- even when extrapolated to a huge scale, may not really have as much an impact as numbers do. Um, and the big example, of course, is the Galactic Empire in Star Wars, which has a lot of spaceships, a very large amount. And another thing relating to numbers is the concept of specialization. For example, certain spaceships are specialized for certain things. Um, and you wouldn't. And if you're doing a one on one against spaceships, it's very important to realize that many of these spaceships have a fleet role, a role in their fleet. They all aren't generic um, generic cruisers that are of just varying sizes, uh, that are all warships that can also accomplish multiple purposes. For example, um, in Star Trek, you've got the NX class, the Constitution class, Refit, Excelsior, Ambassador, Galaxy, Nebula, Intrepid, and Sovereign, and they all are varyingly categorized as some sort of explorers, which in the context of Star Trek means that they are essentially jack of all trades spaceships. They can go large distances and in respect to the time period that they're in, of course, and they can carry some degree of cargo. They can carry out diplomatic missions, and they also can carry out military missions, and etc. Meanwhile, there are other spaceships which are a bit more purpose built for certain things. For example, the Shintaka orbital weapons platform is a it is sessile in the sense that it in itself cannot move between planets. It doesn't have a warp drive on it. It has a specific role, and it isn't really well. I guess you could call it a spaceship depending on the context. I guess it's probably large enough on the inside that if repairs needed to be made, you could actually send someone inside it. So technically, you could call it a spaceship. And also, it would need some degree of maneuvering thrusters in order to move around, um, in order to ensure that orbit is kept and to make sure that small bits of debris in space don't destroy it, etc. So, of course, it is technically a kind of spaceship, but its fleet role is very different from that of the Galler class, for example, which is another Cardassian thing. And the same thing is true for various spaceships in Star Wars, where they all each have a different fleet role. For example, the Death Glider. Uh, a Death Glider in Stargate does not have the capability of entering hyperspace on its own, which means that that's a huge disadvantage that it in itself has. It also doesn't have shields, or at least any meaningful kinds of shields. Uh, on the other hand, a Hatak does have hyperspace and does also have um, some pretty powerful shields. So what I'm trying to get at here is that sometimes certain things work better in the context of their fleet. For example, a World War II naval fleet. You'd have some carriers, then you've got your cruisers, your battleships, your destroyers, small attack craft, etc. All and supply vessels. I don't. I guess they're called tenders. Uh, is is what I'm thinking of specifically. And I know I'm not the biggest expert on various naval stuff, so there's probably a lot of other types of ship that I haven't mentioned that exist and in World War II would be relevant in the Pacific War. And and of course, any one of these ships, you wouldn't, except for maybe the cruiser in a historical context from what its name implies, that cruisers are generally a type of ship that historically, I don't know if it's the same for World War II, but in the original conception of what a cruiser is, a cruiser would be able to operate independently. But many of these ships aren't really made to operate independently, especially in battle. Same thing with infantry. Um, you have the soldiers in a fire team. They often times have different roles. There's uh, in an army, soldiers carry different weapons based on what roles they have. Some of them might have a machine gun or a sniper rifle or an anti tank weapon of some sort. There's all sorts of different things. Same thing with tanks. Some tanks historically were designed in order to drop something onto a trench uh, to allow people to pass over it. And of course, those tanks would be limited when set up to operate such a procedure. They would be limited in the ways that they could attack. So, of course, when engaging in such a an operation, you would expect other uh, tanks or infantry or air support, something else to be around protecting this vehicle while it's accomplishing the task. Um, so this idea of specialization is very important when taking into account fleet battles. Certain spaceships do different things. In addition to that, you, when extrapolating from small engagements to large engagements, you might say, well, we've got an equal types of not equal types, an equal number of types of fleet operations, an equal fleet composition of the types of ships you've got, and then the fleets fight against each other, and one would win. And it's important to remember that even if one would win, the question may not be how big is each fleet or what are the specializations of the different spaceships in the fleet. The question may also be how many fleets are there, especially in the context of the Borg or the Galactic Empire, which operates many and many spaceships. Um, they have ships all over the place, all over the galaxy, doing various things. And if you were to bunch them all together, they certainly would be able to crush their opponents if their opponents had bunched everything together. So this also leads into the concept of asymmetrical warfare. Sometimes numbers win, but sometimes numbers don't win. Um, Even if the person who has the detriment, the lower amount of numbers, also has weaker weapons, that person might still be able to win in some ways, and we and they can do this through some sort of asymmetrical warfare, a guerrilla warfare, um, warfare where you're hitting and running, and you are only focusing on targets that will have that will give you a strategical advantage. For example, in Star Wars, the rebellion against the Empire had many more spaceships than the rebellion, and if you were to take all of the military might of the Empire and put it in one place, and all of the military might of the rebellion and put it in one place, and set them against each other, I would bet that the Empire would win. In fact, would win to an extreme level, and as such, it the only way the rebellion can win is through asymmetrical warfare, as we see in them targeting the Death Star, which was a significant advantage that the Empire had, and also in eventually killing the leaders of the Empire, the Emperor and Darth Vader. And of course, we can go into the expanded universe, the legends, etc., some other time. I'm not too well versed in that part of the lore. I'm just going on. They definitely had a victory at Endor. Of course, I don't expect that to indicate that they were done. Of course, there's probably still a lot of mopping up to do around the galaxy at the end of Star Wars Return of the Jedi. And a similar thing in Star Trek you can see with the Federation and the Borg. And the reason the Federation win against the Borg is because the Borg somehow have some sort of uh, it's I well, there's a few different ways to interpret it. You could interpret it as the Borg aren't really worried about the Federation, so they don't fight seriously against them. Um, because the Borg don't have to, because the Federation aren't really encroaching upon the Borg. Um, Another way to interpret it is plot-induced stupidity, especially some things that happen in Voyager, where you would think that the Borg would definitely capture Voyager, but they didn't. And another reason could be that it's been hypothesized that the Borg have some sinister plan, that they're just testing the Federation and forcing them to adapt, so that then the Borg can adapt to what the Federation is uh, is putting out against them, and they're essentially forcing the Federation to build up their technology so that the Borg can build up their technology from that even higher, um, which would make sense in the context of, for example, the Defiant is something that came out of the Federation's defeat at the Battle of Wolf 359. So, although the Defiant itself, in its original design, was considered a design failure. Um, so, not a complete design failure, but it had several design shortcomings, owing to it being overpowered for its size. Anyway, so what I'm trying to say is, however, is that throughout the Next Generation and Voyager, and and the movie First Contact, we see that there's some degree of asymmetrical warfare. Um, of course, in First Contact, I don't think that's asymmetrical warfare because uh, it was one Borg cube against all fleets that the Federation could gather at Sector 001. And however, in Voyager, we see an event where they beam a torpedo on top of a Borg, not on top, inside of a Borg ship, and it explodes, which is an example of asymmetrical warfare, as opposed to generally just firing upon the Borg cube. And and that's what I'm trying to say. It's that numbers do matter if you're going, especially if you're going with symmetrical warfare. But in some instances, there's asymmetrical warfare. For example, another Star Trek example is uh, the Cardassians and the Bajoran resistance. That is another example. Or I was thinking of something else, but I can't really think of anything specific. Hopefully, I wasn't too all over the place. Hopefully, in the end, my words do have coherence to them. So I'll just summarize what I said again. Um, Ship versus ship is good, but it's important to remember that some ships have fleet roles and have a sort of synergy that comes about when operating in such roles. In addition to that, sometimes you might have better ships, but the other side has significantly greater numbers, and that can overcome the advantage of better ships. In addition to that, sometimes you are so much better that even with a handful of individuals like the Q Continuum, you could probably wipe out anything else. Um, and sometimes, even if you have the advantage of superior equipment and superior numbers, you may still not be able to win due to someone uh, being asymmetrically strategic. And I guess this doesn't just apply to science fiction power scaling, but also to power scaling in general, and some real life strategy as well. So anyway, thank you all for watching. This video didn't really have anything to do with the spreadsheet, so I don't know why I even recorded with it. But you know what? It's better than nothing. At least there is something to look at. So thank you all for watching, and I will be seeing you all next time on Awiltos over and out.